Hi there, it's May 2022. My name is Rhiannon Simpson. I'm a PhD student at the University of Western Ontario, and I'd like to unpack some of the findings of a study I undertook with my friends Dr. Ruth Wright and soon to be Dr. Kyle Davids. David Carruthers once described the field of music education as actively resistant to change, with Williams and Randall and Powell et al. And countless others using similar kinds of language when discussing the perpetuation of paradigmatic practices in music education. With the art music dominant paradigm of practice critiqued for only engaging a small number of students and offering only a narrow understanding of contemporary musicianship, seeking to understand approaches which encourage teachers to break away from this typical practice and consider implementing alternate methods are necessary. Though Stauffer argues that teacher preparation programs may be the greatest impediment to curricular change, research from Powell et al. And others notes that thoughtfully designed university courses can encourage music teachers to alter their practice and embrace progressive pedagogical and curricular approaches. The research I'm speaking about today examines the influence that a master's level course exploring digital music making and popular musicianship had on the practices of 5 in-service educators. This particular iteration of the course was offered as a 2-week summer intensive soon after it was announced that K-12 learning in the majority of Canadian schools will be moved to either an online or hybrid format. 27 master's students took the course, the majority of whom were in-service educators preparing to facilitate online learning during the upcoming semester. The 5 participants in this study each took part in a semi-structured interview with a researcher, and their assessments submitted for the courses, including online video reflections and proposed unit plans exploring digital popular musicianships, were analysed. We were interested in whether the course influenced their willingness to employ methods stemming from the digital practices of popular musicians within their classrooms, whether COVID-19 and social distancing measures influenced this willingness, and the extent to which teachers in the course could foresee themselves using these methods after COVID-19 protocols were lifted. It's notable that all but one of the participants stated that prior to the course and COVID-19, they were employing practices rooted in the discourses of art musicianship, in particular large ensemble instruction and teacher-centered pedagogies. To analyse these data, we employed concepts rooted in the thinking of Pierre Bourdieu. Now, this might surprise some people, seeing as we're interested in the extent to which change had occurred in the practices and mindsets of teachers, and Bourdieu's thinking is often criticised as being deterministic and thus unable to explain processes of change. However, it's notable that most of this critique refers to Bourdieu's most well-known thinking tool, the theory of practice, rather than his later concepts more readily associated with change, such as hysteresis. The theory of practice argues that human behaviour or practice is informed by the skills, knowledges and holdings that are considered valuable within particular contexts or fields. These fields may be physical spaces like within a school ground or a classroom, or they may be non-physical spaces like the field of music education. Different fields may value different capitals. For example, knowledge of performance etiquette for art music concerts like not clapping between movements is incredibly valuable when in a concert hall during a performance of Beethoven. However, this knowledge may not hold as much value within a rock music venue where it's expected that you are interacting with the band consistently. Our ability to orally recognise the major 7 chord is highly valued in the field of music education, but may be seen as less valuable in the field of biology. It is important to note that Bourdieu theorises that those within different fields are predisposed to perpetuate the value of capital already deemed valuable within that context, creating a cycle in which the same skills, knowledges and values remain seen as valuable across time. He argues that this predisposition is unconscious and labels it habitus. Music education scholars like our co-author Ruth Wright have cited this concept to explain the continued dominance of large ensemble instruction and art musicianship within music education. If the field has always positioned art musicianship as holding more value in educational spaces, it produces students and therefore educators who unconsciously reinforce this notion. Thus, despite dramatic changes to the types of music listened to by students outside of the field of formal music education, and dramatically different ways in which that music is learnt and created, music teaching tends to still rely on the use of instruments, ensembles and pedagogies rooted in the discourses of art musicianship. When applied to music education, Bourdieu's theories lend insight into the reason why concepts not readily associated with art musicianship, like improvisation, digital instrumentations, music technologies, and popular musicianship, remain largely absent from many pre-service teacher education programs in North America, and consequently are largely absent from the classrooms of many of these teaching graduates. When we asked the participants in this research about their prior experience with music technology and popular musicianship before this course, they described this area of music learning as not my specialty and their knowledge of it as basic. Even those participants who had engaged with music technologies and popular musicianship outside of their teacher training pathways noted that their classrooms remained largely informed by the discourses of art musicianship. They inferred that these practices afforded more capital within the field of music education and were thus positioned as more valuable in classroom spaces. This is exemplified by a quote from participant 1, who said, "I found that I always felt guilty about doing more pop stuff with my kids. Because when I talk to music teachers in my district, a lot of them are like, oh yeah, we're looking at Beethoven right now and we're looking at Mozart. And I'm like, I'm not really doing that. And I almost felt guilty because in undergrad, what do? We study Beethoven, we study Mozart. We know that that's kind of what you're taught when you become a music teacher. You're taught all of this classical stuff, and I almost feel guilty, like, am I doing enough theory? I'm definitely not doing enough theory. I'm definitely not doing enough classical music." This feeling of guilt when exploring non-paradigmatic practices within the classroom indicates that there's an expectation to perpetuate the value of capital associated with art musicianship within the field of music education. This expectation is informed by their own experiences as music learners, the discourse of the pre-service education programs, and norms reinforced by teachers around them. Later in this interview, participant 1 noted that they had not consciously reflected on these feelings of guilt or the ways in which they may shape their teaching practice prior to the course, demonstrating the unconscious yet powerful influence habitus has on the actions of individuals. Most other participants noted similar feelings of unease when attempting to introduce practices not commonly associated with art musicianship into their classrooms prior to this course and the advent of COVID-19. When considering this unconscious enculturation into a system which perpetuates art musicianship as most valuable within educational settings, it's hard to imagine changes to the paradigm of music education ever occurring, or teachers who utilize non-art music-centric practices as being anything but outliers to the general rule in a North American context. However, Bourdieu's lesser-known concept of hysteresis was specifically theorized to explore the ways in which change can occur in the hearts, minds, and practices of those whose habitus predisposes them to perpetuate the status quo. Bourdieu argues that a state of hysteresis occurs in individuals when the environment that they encounter is too different from the one to which they are objectively adjusted. When a teacher's habitus predisposes them to perpetuate the value of capital that is already valued in the field of music education, there's no tension. However, when the skills, knowledges, and holdings valued within a field change, a teacher may be left with dispositions out of line with the field and left holding capital that is no longer of value or use. In the context of this research, it's notable that the past experiences of most formally trained music educators in North America predispose them to perpetuate practices rooted in the discourses of art musicianship, including instruction centered around large ensembles, the performance of canonic art music pieces, the importance placed on synchronous music making, and the dominant use of non-digital instruments. Though these educators are increasingly likely to be exposed to some courses exploring the ways in which pedagogies and curricula which don't stem from the discourses of art musicianship could inform their practice, the dominant content of many pre-service education programs in North America and the habitus of North American educators positions art music-centric practice as natural without much conscious consideration. However, social distancing measures introduced in response to the COVID-19 pandemic rendered these paradigmatic practices largely impossible. Large ensemble rehearsals were not able to take place with social distancing measures. Online latency issues disallowed the possibility of synchronous music making, and some music programs banned the playing of brass and woodwind instruments in fear that they may spread the virus at a higher rate. Suddenly, pedagogical approaches which once aligned with the capital valued in the field of music education and art musicianship were unable to be implemented and thus of less value within a pandemic context. Skills and knowledges once positioned as holding less value within the field of music education, such as the ability to utilize music technologies, facilitate non-synchronous music making, and having an understanding of digital instrumentations became necessary and thus highly valued. With a lot of research noting the absence of such discourses from music teacher education programs, it's notable that many in-service teachers were unlikely to already possess such capital before the field shifted. Thus, it's likely that this phenomenon prompted a state of hysteresis in teachers, or as Courtney put it, a dislocation between the habitus which formerly produced success in the field and the habitus currently necessary following changes in field conditions. Bourdieu positions hysteresis as holding the potential to prompt long-term change in the types of capital and thus practices considered of value in previously stagnant fields. When paired with reflexive practice, he notes that hysteresis has the potential to illuminate alternate possibilities to dominant practices that may have never been consciously considered by agents if the capital they possessed and that of value in the field always aligned. However, in their brilliant paper, Yang argues that without explicit instruction providing teachers with the opportunity to gain the knowledges, skills, and holdings newly of value within the field of education, neither hysteresis nor reflexive practice can prompt change. The course of focus within this study serves as an example of explicit instruction, aiming to provide in-service educators with capital of value within the context of online music education within pandemic measures. The study aimed to see if the students of this class utilise this newly developed capital to implement practices they may not have consciously considered prior to the hysteresis caused by COVID-19. It was clear within the data that the recognition that paradigmatic practices could not be implemented within pandemic measures prompted a state of hysteresis, which allowed teachers to recognise the potential of new tools, learn new skills, and reposition themselves within the field. Participants expressed that the pandemic allowed them to think outside the box in terms of practices which could be implemented in their classroom. And this language is incredibly telling, with the pandemic framed as a way to gain freedom from their own expectations regarding what music teaching could or should look like. The participant who provided this quote previously focused much of their lesson planning on group singing in preparation for live performances. However, they state that the pandemic pushed me to make more manipulatives and to try things that I would not have done before because we focused so much on singing. Similarly, participant 3 noted that the pandemic pushed some interesting things that we might not have gotten to experience otherwise. Though this participant was at times hesitant of these new approaches to teaching and learning, he noted that the whole COVID of it all means that you had to deal with the cards you were dealt, no matter what. In this sense, COVID-19 is framed as an opportunity to explore new practices and acquire new capital, even those you may have been resistant to in previous contexts. The practical nature of the course aimed to provide students with the skills and knowledges necessary if they deem that they would like to implement these methods into their practice. Participant 1 argued that after the course they are 100% more willing to use technology and to actually advocate for myself to use it, and argued that I feel like I got the most practical things out of this course, things I could actually use in my classroom. Each participant interviewed had employed at least one of the online activities explored in the course into their teaching practice, and indicated that experiencing these activities as students themselves aided them in effectively doing so. All participants but one had introduced the DAW software BandLab, which was a focus throughout the course, into their classrooms, including those who had no experience with DAWs beforehand. Thus, participants indicated that the course provided them with the type of explicit instruction required to develop capital associated with popular music-based instruction in an online context. Yang argues that this, paired with reflexive practice, a vital part of the assessment process for the course, and a state of hysteresis, may prompt changes which last after pandemic measures are lifted. However, Courtney highlights that the embracement of new capitals and changes to practice is just one way people may respond to a state of hysteresis. In other cases, they note that agents may attempt to force field conditions to return to those which suited their habitus. Bourdieu notes that this may be an even more common response, as there is an inertia of habitus which has a spontaneous tendency to perpetuate structures corresponding to their conditions of production. In other words, the habitus is considered to be durable, and thus predispositions informed by earlier experiences, such as those as a school student or pre-service educators, are likely to continue to inform practice even after exposure to hysteresis and conscious consideration of change. In this case, teachers may attempt to reinforce the value of capital they already possessed within an online context, and plan to return to practices which reinforce the value of this capital once pandemic measures are lifted in the future. This is exemplified in the responses of participant 3, who states, "I expect that once COVID has gone down in severity and gatherings are permitted again, concerts will return, and for those to look fairly similar to the way they have been in the past." Though participant 3 notes that the course prompted him to make some changes to the process of their assessment practices, in particular the use of student-chosen musics and notation systems within technical instrumental assessments, attempts to teach online classes in a way that perpetuates the value of previously held capital associated with art musicianship is notable. Participant 3 notes that attempts to facilitate synchronous online ensemble rehearsals at his schools were rendered impossible due to latency However, the value of large ensemble instruction, presentational music performances, and master-apprentice pedagogical methods continued to be perpetuated within the online practices of this school. When describing a current unit he's engaging in, participant 3 states that currently we're working at all levels on teaching online band, which is non-concurrent rehearsal focusing on performance recordings, which will then be compiled into videos. There's an expectation that there is a concert, and so that will take a digital form. So right now I'm collecting a whole bunch of grainy cell phone videos of middle schoolers playing their music, and we're going to use a software to smoosh it all together. Later, when asked if music softwares had become a larger part of their teaching practice after the course, participant 3 highlights the newly introduced use of smart music in his school, a software not explored within the graduate course, which prompts students to play along to formal 5-line Western notation and gives real-time feedback when mistakes are made. This process is not too dissimilar to a traditional master-apprentice model explored by Nettle, in which a teacher's role is to correct a student's instrumental performance to sound more similar to that of an audio recording. Kingsbury notes that this is a hallmark of instruction associated with art musicianship, particularly for those who were formally trained in the conservatoire tradition. The use of technology in this manner highlights Erkovich's assertions that music education often receive technology with strategies of assimilation, where technology is perceived as simply a device to extend the status quo. In their report, they give an example of a musician using an iPad to display 300-year-old sheet music. The potential of the iPad to explore new ways of teaching and learning is not embraced. Rather, it's just a way to continue perpetuating norms of music learning as they existed before. The use of asynchronous video to create a performance which gives the illusion of presentational synchronous music making, or the embracing of a software which reinforces the master-apprentice model of instruction, do not indicate changes to the types of capital value within the music program. The assimilation of technology to reinforce existing discourses instead allows music instruction to be moved into an online context without the re-evaluation of symbolic capitals and sources of legitimacy that Hardy notes can be prompted by a state of hysteresis. Thus, experiencing hysteresis does not necessarily lead to a change to the way in which a teacher will approach their practice. One's willingness to explore and embrace alternate approaches requires a space in which teachers feel they have the freedom to do so. It also requires a willingness to become conscious of their own habitus and reflect upon the structures that have shaped the ways in which they have taught in the past. These, when paired with explicit instruction, which aids in teachers to develop the skills and knowledges of increased value within a changing field, may promote the embracement of non-paradigmatic methods, or they may not. As Hardy stresses, hysteresis is experienced at a personal level, and each person's response to it will differ. However, the explicit development of music education courses which consider all aspects of Yang's model of change may be able to take advantage of the hysteresis caused by the pandemic to foster the consideration of non-paradigmatic methods in ways that may not have been possible just 3 years ago. As Citizen et al. Put it, the pandemic has brought a seismic shift in the use of electronics, the internet, and remote learning in ways that could create more openness and responsiveness to the need for ongoing education and training over the life course. Though the field of music education has been labelled as resistant to change by many scholars, the development of professional development courses with Yang's model of change and Bourdieu's concept of hysteresis firmly in mind may see the current climate as one best able to rectify this lack of openness to new music education approaches. The course of focus in this study is just one example of many, which may take advantage of the ways in which the pandemic has forced every educator to reconsider what practices are considered valuable within their instructional spaces, and thus foster change. I'm incredibly interested to hear of more research exploring the influence of the pandemic on the field of music education as it continues to come to light. Thank you so much.